Let's talk about namespaces. When you define a function, a constant, or a class without a namespace definition, by default they will be put in a global space. So for example, here I have a transaction class that is within payment gateway Stripe directory, and this class is just an empty class for now, and I'm var dumping the new instance of that class. Now as you can see, this class does not have any namespace defined to it, so PHP will try to locate this file in the global space, and it finds it there, and therefore everything works. However, this might cause name collision where you might have multiple classes that have the same name. To show you this in action, I created another folder here called paddle, which is another gateway, and I created another class transaction in there. Now if I go to index.php, everything still works if I refresh the page, but if I try to require the transaction from the paddle class as well, and even if I comment this out, because PHP will not know which one to instantiate, right, because you're including two classes with the same name. But when you require two classes that have the same name and they are not namespaced, meaning that they're in the global space, this will cause an error. So if I refresh the page, we'll get cannot declare class transaction. And before namespaces were introduced, often this was solved by simply prefixing the class name with the vendor name or the namespace name within the class. In addition to the name collision fixes, it also lets you better structure and organize your classes and code. Same thing would happen with the constants or functions. So if I had a function here called foo and define the same function in here, and we refresh the page, we would get the similar error, but this time about the function. And same thing would happen about the constant. So if I had constant foo equals to 1, and the same thing here, and let's set this equals to 2, and let's remove the functions, and if we refresh, we get the same error that constant foo already is defined. So as you can see, this can happen for classes, which includes abstract classes, interfaces, traits, functions, and constants. We can use namespaces to fix this problem. Think of namespaces as virtual directory structures for your classes. We can define namespaces using the namespace keyword on top of the file before any code and after declare statement. So if you're declaring your strict types or using declare statement here, the namespace has to go after that and before any code. So you would put it somewhere here, namespace, and then you just put your namespace here. Now you can just have a single namespace, so you could call this your name or your package name or whatever you want. So I could call this geo, for example. And now on the index.php, let me comment this out. When I include this paddle, the location does not change, right? The location is still the same thing, but when I var dump this, if I refresh the page, I'm going to get class transaction not found error. And the reason for this is because PHP is looking for the transaction class by default in global space. We have two ways to fix this. One is we need to add qualifying class name, including the namespace in here. So we would do something like geo \transaction, and if we refresh, that will work. Or another way is we could import this class, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, in addition to having this single namespace name, you could have sub namespaces, which makes more sense, and you can make your namespaces follow the directory structure. So in this case, we have payment gateway and paddle. So in here, we can do, instead of geo, we can do payment gateway \paddle. And if you wanted or were working on an open source package, you would probably namespace everything with your name or your package name, as I mentioned. So you would put something like my package name in the beginning and then everything else. But we'll keep it simple for now. Now let's add the same namespace to Stripe here, and we'll just need to change this to Stripe. And if we go here and uncomment this, we need to change this to payment gateway Stripe transaction. And if we refresh the page, now we're no longer getting the error that we're declaring the same class twice, and it actually initializes the Stripe transaction class, and we see that object printed right here. So everything is working. Just something to note here, that I matched my namespace to the folder structure, which is why I said to think of namespaces as virtual directory structures. This is not a requirement. You can put the file anywhere you want and still namespace it any way you want. But it is recommended and also a standard to match namespace with the folder structure. The other way you could do this is by importing the transaction class from the namespace by using the use keyword. So you could do use and then put the fully qualifying class name here. So payment gateway Stripe transaction. And now you don't need to do this. You can simply do new transaction. So if we refresh the page, everything still works. In addition to namespacing and importing classes, you can namespace constants and functions and import them as well. Though this is not widely used and I personally don't encourage using it, so I'm not going to show examples of it, but basically you could namespace your custom functions and constants and then import them using use and then function and specify the function name after your namespace, or you could do the same thing for constants using use const. If you want to know more about this, I will leave the links in the description and you can check it out. So let's move on to instantiating classes that are within the same namespaces. So for example, let's create a class here called customer profile, and it is in the same namespace paddle. And in the paddle transaction class, I'm going to close out the Stripe transaction so we don't get confused. So we have the paddle transaction class open, and within the paddle transaction class, we want to use the customer class. In that case, you don't need to specify the fully qualifying class name. You can simply reference to the class using the class name. So we could do var dump new customer profile, and this will work. Let me go to index.php and change this to paddle, and if we refresh the page, I'm getting fatal error class not found, and that's because I forgot to include this file in the index.php. So we need to do require once paddle customer profile, or we could include it within the transaction class, but let's just include everything in the index.php for now, and then we'll see how easy it is to do this with auto loading in the next lesson. So now if we refresh the page, everything works, and as you can see, we have the customer profile object here, and we did not have to specify the fully qualifying class name, and we did not need to import this. And that works because PHP will try to load this from the current local namespace if you are in a namespaced file or a class. And in this case, we are in a namespaced file, and therefore it's trying to load this from the current namespace, which is this, and this class exists in the current namespace, and it works. If we were to remove the namespace from here and we go to index.php, and let's remove it from here as well, and let me comment out the Stripe transaction for now. So now we have only paddle transaction, so we're not going to get the error about having the same class name, but if I refresh the page, we're going to get an error that customer profile class is not found. So what's happening here is that PHP is trying to load this from the global space, and this does not exist in the global space because customer profile is namespaced to payment gateway paddle. If I were to remove the namespace from here as well, then everything will work. So let's revert that back, and let's change this back as well, and everything still works. So because PHP will try to load classes from the current namespace when you're in a namespaced file, if you were to access PHP's built-in classes, you will need to add a backslash to tell PHP to load it from the global space, or you will need to import them. For example, there is a PHP's built-in class called datetime, and we haven't covered this yet, and we'll get into that later in this course, but this is the class that allows you to work with dates in PHP. Now, if I did this and we are in a namespaced file, this is not going to work, and as you can see, my IDE is highlighting this, letting me know that this class does not exist, and if I refresh the page, we're going to get an error. And let's see what happens. Let's read the error message. So it says that class payment gateway paddle datetime is not found. So as you can see, what PHP is trying to do is that it's trying to locate datetime class in the current namespace, and the current namespace, as mentioned before, is this right here. So payment gateway paddle datetime class does not exist, and therefore it's throwing an error. To fix this, we need to add a backslash here, and backslash here basically tells PHP to not load the datetime from the local namespace, but go to the global namespace. And if we refresh, now it works. Another way to fix this is to simply import datetime, and then we can remove the backslash from here, and it will still work. On the other hand, if you actually had a datetime class that existed within the same namespace, so let's quickly create create one so I can show you an example. So I'm going to create a datetime class here, and it's within the same namespace. And let's remove this. And in this case, when we do new datetime, it's going to use the local datetime class because we're in the local namespace. And if I refresh, we're going to get this error again because I forgot to include it. So let's add it right here, datetime. Let's refresh, and everything works. But this might not always be ideal because you might want to use PHP's built-in class instead. So in that case, you would need to use the backslash, in which case you would use PHP's built-in class, or as mentioned before, you would need to import this using use datetime. And now if you refresh, it will still work. Let me show you an example when you try to create an object of another class that is in another namespace. So for example, I created a class called email under the notification namespace. And let's try to create a new object of email within our constructor in the transaction class. So if we go here and we type notification email, my IDE is highlighting this, letting me know that something isn't right. And this is correct. We're going to get an error. If we go to the browser and refresh the page, we're going to get the fatal error. And let's read the error message. Notice the path here to the email class. It's trying to locate the email class under payment gateway paddle notification namespace. But we did not specify that, right? We're saying that we want to create an object of email class from notification namespace. This is because we're using the qualified name and not the full qualified name. And the difference between the qualified and fully qualified name is that fully qualified name is prefixed by backslash, which indicates that this is the full namespace to that class. When you use the qualified name instead of the fully qualified name, then what PHP will do is that it will try to see if there is an import statement that resolves to notification namespace. And if it does, then this would work. But in this case, we don't have a use statement where we're importing the notification namespace, and therefore by default PHP will prepend the current namespace to this qualified name. So in the end, it becomes payment gateway paddle notification email. And because email class does not exist in that namespace, we get this error. So we could fix this two ways. One is we could prepend it with the backslash to make it fully qualified name, or we could simply import it and then it would work. I'm going to leave the link to this documentation page that explains the name resolution rules. So if we look at it here, we have the unqualified name, which is just the class name without any namespace separator or identifier. Then we have the qualified name, which has the namespace and then the class name. And this is the example that we just went over with. And then we have the fully qualified name where we have the namespace separator in the beginning, which is the backslash right here. And then we have all these rules right here that you could read up and see how it gets resolved. Let's see some examples when working with functions. As you remember, if we deleted this datetime class here and removed it from the index.php, and within our transaction.php we did new datetime and we removed the use statement, we would get an error, right? Because it's looking at the local namespace and the datetime class does not exist. What happens if you use PHP's built-in functions? What if we did something like explode, which, as you know, splits the string based on the delimiter and returns an array? So how would this get resolved? If we refresh the page, we get the array of two elements, hello and world, which means that it's resolving this from the global space using PHP's built-in explode function. But how come it doesn't work that way when working with classes? So what happens is that for classes, PHP will try to locate them in the local namespace, and if it doesn't exist, it will throw you an error, unless you had the use statement where you imported that class. But with functions, if the function does not exist in the local namespace, then it falls back to the global namespace. And in this case, explode does not exist in the local namespace, and therefore it falls back to the global namespace and uses PHP's built-in function. Now you could override this and create a custom function called explode, which accepts the separator and the string. For now, let's just do return foo. So if we refresh the page, it's printing foo and not the array of hello and world because it's resolving to the local explode function within the local namespace instead of using the PHP's built-in function from the global namespace. Now this sometimes can be intended, but sometimes can cause unexpected bugs. So you would need to prefix this with backslash to ensure that you're using PHP's built-in function from the global space instead of the locally defined function in that namespace. So if I refresh, we're going to get the array back, which is one of the reasons why you would see some developers use backslash when using PHP's built-in functions in namespace classes. Another reason why they would prefix PHP's built-in functions with backslash is the a possible speed improvement because you're telling PHP exactly where to load that function from, and PHP does not have to resolve it, which could have positive impact on performance, but very negligible. Alright, let's move on to aliasing. Let's get rid of this explode function from here, and let's also remove this from here. And let's go to index.php, and let's assume that for whatever reason we needed to use both transaction classes. Right now we're creating an object of the paddle transaction class, but let's say we also needed to create a transaction from Stripe. So we would do use Stripe transaction, and let's say paddle transaction equals new transaction, and then Stripe transaction equals new transaction, and let's var dump both paddle and Stripe transactions. Now as you can see, there is already something wrong here. My IDE is underlining this here. Now let's refresh the page, and we're getting the similar error message that states that transaction class name already exists and it's in use. So what's happening here is that we're importing two transaction classes that have the same name. So PHP would not know which one to use to create your objects, so it doesn't even get to this point. It fails right here, and this can happen in a lot of cases. This might not be the best example for it because you would not use two transaction classes in the same file, but this can certainly happen for other classes where you might have two classes that share the same name and you want to use both of them in the same file. This can be fixed by aliasing one of the classes, and you're able to do that in PHP. So in here we can do payment gateway Stripe transaction as Stripe transaction. So now when we do new transaction, this will always refer to the paddle transaction. So if we refresh the page, both of these are paddle transaction objects, but now we could change the second one to Stripe transaction, and if we refresh, now we get paddle transaction and Stripe transaction. Aliasing can also be used to deal with long class names. Another use case for aliasing would be that if we were inside our payment gateway paddle transaction class and you were using some kind of package or a library that also has the transaction class in there, and you want to use that transaction class or extend from in your transaction class, then you would need to do something like use vendor name transaction, and this would not work, of course, because your current class name is transaction and you're trying to import another class with the same name, and you would get the same error. So this is where you would use aliasing as well. You would give it a nickname, so you would say as vendor transaction, and you could name this whatever you want, but vendor would be usually the name of the package or the author of the library, and then you would use this class within your transaction class. We actually have another transaction class and we can simulate this. So we could actually use the payment gateway Stripe transaction class, and if we don't alias it, as you can see, it's already underlining it, and if we refresh the page, we're going to get the same error. But if we do as paddle transaction, now everything will still work. So aliasing can be very useful. If you're importing multiple classes from the same namespace, you could actually group them together. So for example, let's say that we needed a customer profile within our index.php. We would typically do something like use payment gateway paddle customer profile, and then here we would do paddle customer profile equals new customer profile, and let's var dump that, and it works. But notice here that we are importing two classes from the paddle namespace, from the payment gateway paddle namespace. We could actually combine this and this together and simply put it in square bracket syntax. So transaction would go inside square brackets, and then you can put comma and the rest of the classes that you want to import along with transaction. So in this case, there would be customer profile, and we can get rid of this. And if we refresh, everything will still work. Another way you could do this, instead of grouping them into a single line, you could simply import the namespace itself. So you could remove this, and now we have the namespace imported. So in here you could just use the qualifying name, so you could prefix with a namespace like this, and same for the customer profile, and this will work as well. If you refresh, everything will work. So in some cases, this is the preferred way, where you're importing a lot of classes from the same namespace, and instead of listing all of them up here, you just import the namespace and then prefix your classes with that namespace. However, I prefer to have everything imported in the use statements, because that way when I open a class, I can see what are all the classes that this specific class or file depends on. And another thing to note about the aliasing is that you could actually alias the entire namespace as well. So in here you could say as PA, for example, and in here you could just do PA transaction and PA customer profile, and if you refresh, everything will still work. Before we wrap up this video, I want to quickly let you know that importing rules are per file basis. What that means is that if we were to include another file here, something like include views layout.php, the included file here will not inherit the classes that were imported in the parent file. So if you wanted to use these classes in the included file, you would need to import them there as well. So this is it for this video. I'm going to leave some links in the description if you want to read more about namespaces. I did not cover some things like having multiple namespaces in the same file because it is not widely used and it is not recommended, and I personally don't use it and don't encourage it, so I decided not to cover them in this video. So let me know in the comments what you think about namespaces and if you have any feedback. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. I'll see you on the next video where we're going to talk about PSR standards, auto loading, and Composer.